more people joining, wearing a uniform, being trained, and that will slowly filter its way through the process. I don't think there's any ideological belief about having to use capita, but for reasons I've already explained, we are seeing progress in the one particular contract that I am responsible for. With regards to the Defence Fire and Rescue Organisation, which also falls under the Army, there has been a court case, and that is currently under review, as the Honourable Lady knows.
Sir.
The United Kingdom shares the United States, European and Gulf partners' concerns about Iran's destabilising activities in the region. And we continue to work closely with our allies and partners to mitigate the threats to regional security.
If the balloon goes up, I'll be ready, and will we help our allies?
Yes, we are, and we are already deployed in the region. This is a region where we have huge stakes and a huge amount invested, and we are working with our allies and partners to firstly try and de-escalate things in the region, but also to truly understand the facts behind recent events.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome Secretary of State to her new job and say some of us will miss her in the International Development Ministry, where she really ploughed her own furrow and was very refreshing. But can I ask her, is our defence forces, are they capable of helping any of our allies, either in the Middle East, or if someone invaded one of our allies in Europe? This is a minuscule armed forces we have. D-Day celebration, 75 years, is in June. We couldn't defend anyone with the size of a defence force we've got at the moment.
Well, first of all, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his kind comments, and I'm sure he will continue his campaign on road traffic accidents and all that Britain can do to prevent those around the world. What I would say to him is that I think our armed forces are getting increasingly more capable. If you look at what we are doing in terms of operations, increasingly we're putting people and forward deploying them. The Royal Navy is undertaking more activity. What we must do, though, is ensure that whether it's the budget or what we're doing with the budget is absolutely linked to the tasks that we require our armed forces to do because of the mission that we give them.
Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week the Deputy British Commander of Operation Inherent Resolve stated that, and I quote, "There's been no increased threat from Iranian-backed forces in Iraq and Syria." Now, he was then rebuked by US Central Command. The Foreign Secretary later went on to declare that the UK and the US share the same assessment of the heightened threat posed by Iran, and the FCO changed its travel advice for Iran. So can the Secretary of State clarify the government's position, and can she confirm that the United Kingdom will oppose any escalations of tension in the Middle East?
Well, we want the tensions that are increasing to de-escalate. I think that the Major General's remarks have been clarified. He was speaking in a particular context, and we are absolutely on the same page in terms of the assessment of risk as the United States, and we've always been clear-eyed about the threats that Iran poses.
Question number 7.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Competition remains the cornerstone of defence procurement policy, except where other strategic considerations need to be taken into account, for example, national security, operational advantage and freedom of action.
I thank the member for his visits to defence companies in my constituency, and indeed for his helpful and inclusive approach when he does visit. However, does he agree with me that the ability of these companies in my constituencies, and British companies in general, will be greatly damaged by a hard Brexit?
Well, I'm grateful for the kind comments that he'd made, and it was a pleasure to meet a number of the businesses in his constituency. I have to say, we have been engaging a lot with the SME supply chain. In fact, just on the 9th of May, I held a round table with small businesses in North Wales, and they felt very optimistic about the future. And I think that we've got an equipment plan here where we are actively engaging with the supply chain to ensure that the opportunities that exist within each of the projects that we're having will maximise the input that they can have.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the Secretary of State to her place. It's an absolute pleasure to see such an amazing woman on the front benches standing up for defence. Mr. Speaker, last Thursday, colleagues, myself and colleagues from across the House launched our APPG on shipbuilding report into the National Shipbuilding Strategy. And we have real concerns that the challenge with competition, particularly for naval shipbuilding, is based on a model which doesn't include the economic benefits to the UK being recycled back in when we spend our UK taxpayers' money. Can the Minister give me some confidence that they're looking at this and that we can actually start to work with the Treasury to change our model so we can get the best value and ensure our shipbuilding pipeline lasts in the UK?
Well, thank my honourable friend for that question. She'll be aware that Sir John Parker is currently doing a review of his initial report. What I would say is that international competition is also about encouraging UK industry and UK shipyards to be as competitive as possible so that they can not only maximise the opportunities that UK defence offer, but actually take advantage of those competitions around the globe too.
The Minister said that it's to make UK yards more efficient, but what they need is throughput of work. His department has chosen to put the contract for the Fleet Sod Support Vessel into international competition. Yeah. So can I ask him what weight is given to his own government's prosperity agenda, sovereign capability and the need to protect UK shipbuilding in that decision?
Well, and it's precisely why the Type 26, Type 31s and the aircraft carriers were built in the UK so that we could maintain that capability here in the United Kingdom. But my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, recently made a speech which you may be aware of, and part of what she is doing is a review into the Mars tankers, just to ensure that we look at exactly what the experiences were with that and take lessons from that.
Does my honourable friend agree that the involvement of small and medium-sized enterprises in defence procurement is essential in promoting innovation in the sector?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. I think one of the things that I've really noticed since being in this role and as I go around the country is actually it is within the SME sector where innovation really does exist. What we've got to try and do is ensure that actually more SMEs feel that they can do business with the Ministry of Defence so that we can take advantage of that for our armed forces.
Mr. Speaker, the government's procurement process for military equipment is a shambles. And nowhere is this better seen than in the way it is handling the procurement for the Type 31E frigates. Having started, then having stopped, then having restarted the procurement process for the Type 31s last year and imposed a totally unrealistic price ceiling of £250 million per frigate, will the Minister confirm that he has now effectively removed this financial ceiling?
I don't actually recognise the interpretation he makes of this competition. This is a challenging competition, and the very reason for that is that we want to ensure that UK industry is competitive, not just in the UK, but around the globe. We have taken a pragmatic approach to change the parameters to ensure consistency with all other competitions that have been happening. This is a challenge to industry, but we want them to be competitive. That was the whole point of the National Shipbuilding Strategy.
Great, sir.
Mr. Speaker, as we discussed in an excellent Westminster Hall debate last week, Commonwealth make an important contribution to our armed force capability. The visa application process is Home Office led, but I do agree there is a moral case of abolishing the visa application fees, and we continue to have discussions with the Home Office to make this case.
Richard Graham.
In her first departmental questions, can I warmly congratulate our first ever female Defence Secretary and thank the Minister for his continued support on this cross-party cause signed by almost 150 MPs from 5 parties in this House. While I recognise what the Minister has said about the possibility of precedents being set by changes to the Immigration Act, does my right honourable friend agree that it should be perfectly possible to make an amendment to the Armed Forces provision of the 1971 Immigration Act so that our Commonwealth servicemen and women can apply free of charge?
he is making a valid point, and we are certainly looking at that Act. The starting salary which that you receive when you come in to join the armed forces does meet the threshold that the Home Office require. The trouble is when you wish to bring a spouse or a partner or indeed your children, that's when you run into these additional minimum income thresholds. But I would take this opportunity, Mr. Speaker, just to acknowledge the thanks to the over 4,500 Commonwealth members of our armed forces and also the over 3,000 Gurkhas who make such a valid and important contribution to our capability.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with everything that was just said by the Honourable Member for Gloucester, but also, could the Minister talk to his opposite number at the Home Office? Because I've had cases of constituents who've travelled halfway across the world, signed up for the armed forces, and then when they leave the armed forces, they're not entitled to benefits because their immigration status hasn't been sorted out, which seems to me to be a fairly miserable way to treat people.
Here.
The Honourable Gentleman makes an absolutely important point. This came up again in the debate as well. It is important, though, that when they embark on this journey, when they sign the papers, when they endeavour to come to the UK, they are fully aware of the current situation. And the Families Federations that we work very closely have made that case, that it's not even clear to those who are actually embarking on the journey as to the fact that it is okay for them to come across, but there will be a financial burden that they'll bump into should they wish to bring in their family. That's what we need to move forward on.
Woodley. Number 9, sir.
Mr. Elwood.
Mr. Speaker, the RAF remains absolutely committed to Lincolnshire as part of our defence rationalisation programme. He is aware that we've had to restructure some of the assets in that county, but we do expect to see considerable investment in the near future.
Mr. Edward Lee.
I apologise to the Minister for banging on about RAF Scampton and its closure, but I won't be satisfied until it's engraved on his heart. Can he relieve the acute distress in Lincolnshire, the closure of RAF Scampton, by announcing very shortly that he's going to keep the Red Arrows in Lincolnshire in one of the three remaining superb RAF bases, Coningsby or Waddington or Cranwell? And can he help the local community by helping with the continuance of the Heritage Centre associated with the Dan Busters raid?
Well, firstly, in reverse order, if I may, Mr. Speaker, could I also pay tribute to that incredible endeavour that took place in May 1943? Barnes Wallis and Guy Gibson, every child grows up knowing what the RAF is all about, partly because of what those brave heroes did back in the middle of the war. And he's also right to point out that this is also the home of the RAF Red Arrows, and it gives me licence, if I may, just to say we look forward to seeing them participate in the air component of the land, sea and air effort to pay tribute on the D-Day 75th anniversary taking place starting from the Defence Secretary's constituency. But he's also aware that we've had to rationalise. Scampton will close. But let's not forget, Lincolnshire remains the heart very much of the RAF. You've got RAF Digby, you've got Cranfield, where the training takes place, Coningsby, of course, where our fast jet component is, and not to mention RAF Waddington, where our ISTAR capability is honed.
Well, we're certainly better informed, but it looks as though we can look forward to a good deal more banging on from the Honourable Gentleman on this important matter. Mr. Steve Double.
Speaker number 10.
Mr. Speaker, before I forget, may I group this question with number 11? The government already does much to support our brave veterans and their families as well. But the first time we are mapping out a 10-year strategy to give greater clarity about how we want that support to develop.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for that answer. But can he say what role he sees the Veterans Advisory and Pensions Committee playing in the development of better care for our military veterans? And does he think there is a case to be made to renew and revitalise this committee, which is, after all, nearly 100 years old now, to play a more prominent and effective role?
Minister Elwood.
He's absolutely right. The way he portrays that, I'm sure he didn't mean to, but it's not the same people on the committee as started off with all those years ago. They have advanced and reformed, and I work with them very, very closely for that exact reason. It is important that when you leave the armed forces, you then are taken on and supported by our country, who's indebted to the service. And so very, very important that we use these committees and others to make sure we provide the support that veterans would expect.
Luke Graham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can my honourable friend tell the House the levels of spending on veterans in all parts of the United Kingdom?
Mr. Speaker, it's difficult to put an exact figure on it, but we estimate that it's in around £7 billion that the MOD spends on our veterans. it's so important that we recognise, as I was saying, that we provide that support wherever it is in the country, whether it be through their pensions that they expect, whether it be through mental health support as well, or simply putting the comradeship to recognise and say thank you once again for their service.
Hanson.
Could the Minister give some indication of how he intends to monitor the delivery of the Covenant, given the recent report by the charity SAFA, which said that only 16% of veterans actually believed it was being delivered effectively?
Well, I think he means not the veterans' strategy, because we haven't started the veterans' strategy yet. We put this out to consultation. We've had over 4,000 replies to this consultation. We're now going through and collating those replies, and I hope to make a statement to the House in the near future as to how we move forward with this 10-year strategy.
Robinson.
Mr. Speaker, as our party's defence spokesperson, can I add my congratulations to the Defence Secretary. The Minister knows my frustration about the unequal and lack of consistent approach when implementing the Armed Forces Covenant across this United Kingdom. As part of the Veterans Strategy, would he look again at the bill I introduced, the 10-minute rule bill I introduced, to ensure a duty of compliance across the United Kingdom?
Mr. Speaker, he touches on two important aspects there. First of all is the obligation to honour the Covenant. It's still in its infancy. We are still working forward this. There's so much work to be done because it is very disparate across the country. There are also specific challenges in Northern Ireland. I've had the pleasure to visit with him to say how can we actually make sure that the Covenant is honoured there, given the very sensitive specific issues that are faced over there.
Julian Lewis.
On behalf of the Defence Committee, may I welcome the Secretary of State to her position, for which she is well qualified indeed, and may I pay tribute to her predecessor, who not only saved our amphibious forces from premature dissolution, but also won considerable battles with one of our real adversaries in defence, namely the Treasury. Through the Minister, may I ask him, as a veteran himself, whether he agrees that part of the veterans' strategy ought to be the protection of former service personnel against repeated re-investigation for their activities in past conflicts. May I welcome the fact that the government seems to be moving towards some sort of qualified statute of limitations approach, but may I urge them to bring their announcement to the floor of the House rather than doing what they suggested they're intending to do at the moment, which is simply put it out as a written statement.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for his comments. I'm afraid I can't provide the full answers because, as he alluded to, the Defence Secretary will be providing more information on this tomorrow.
Yes, but a written statement simply won't meet the needs of the case. I think I can say that with the chair, that the appetite, and I'm very grateful for the nod of affirmation from the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Seven Oaks, the former Secretary of State for Defence. The House will clearly wish to question ministers on this matter, and therefore it needs to be done in the Chamber. Mark Francois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I join the chairman of the committee as a fellow committee member in welcoming the Secretary of State to her new responsibilities, not least as she carries the Queen's Commission. Can I emphasise the point made by the chairman of the committee, and indeed by you, Mr. Speaker, that the most important issue with regard to veterans is protecting them from lawfare and legal witch hunting. And so can I say it is absolutely imperative that the Secretary of State makes an oral statement to the House tomorrow so that all members from across the House can question her on her proposals, which I'm sure we will welcome given half a chance.
Mr. Speaker, so many have rightly congratulated the Defence Secretary, but for the first time it's been credited the fact that she is a reservist in the Naval Reserve, which leaves only one member of the front bench who is not in uniform at the moment. That's the Procurement Minister, so no pressure on him to join one element of the forces or another. With regards to the substantive question, the point has been made and the Defence Secretary will be in her place tomorrow.
Julia Lopez.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is clearly important that we provide appropriate protection for sensitive research with defence or security applications, whether conducted in our universities or, in fact, indeed in industry. And that's why we work closely with other government departments, agencies and international partners to ensure suitably robust arrangements which keep pace with developments in technology and the wider global context.
Recent media reports highlight increasing concerns about scientists linked to the People's Liberation Army working in UK universities on research relevant to the development of sensitive military technologies. Does the Minister share this concern? Is he working with universities to mitigate the risk of financial dependency on or the sharing of sensitive technologies with China? And will clearer guidance be developed on academic areas deemed relevant to national security?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for raising this very important issue, and I can confirm that we do work closely with universities to inform them of the risk posed by military-civilian research fusion. Universities are subject to the UK strategic export controls as anyone else in the UK and should consult with the Department for International Trade before engaging in any relationships focusing on technology which could have a military applications, and further guidance is available on the gov.uk website.
Question 13, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I would like to answer questions 13 and 24 together. The 2015 Strategic Defence and Security Review introduced a new national security objective to promote UK prosperity. We subsequently published strategies for the shipbuilding and combat air and refreshed our defence industrial policy, with a new emphasis on supporting growth and competitiveness. On the 14th of March, we provided an update to Parliament on our ambitious Defence Prosperity Programme.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Secretary of State described our Type 26 frigates as the envy of the world, and they are powered by the most capable and the quietest electric drive motors that are designed and made by GE in Rugby. Is the Minister as delighted as I am at today's news that the Ministry is bringing forward orders for the motors for the second batch of these vessels, which enables this vitally important facility to remain here in the UK?
Well, can I first of all, Mr. Speaker, praise my honourable friend for the work that he has done in fighting for the factory in his constituency. I couldn't walk down a corridor without bumping into him and him lobbying hard, and that's why I made sure that I met with GE, and I am pleased to inform him that this morning GE has announced to its staff that it's reached an agreement with the MOD that will enable the company to continue the work there in his constituency. I'd also like to pay tribute to my officials who have worked incredibly hard on this to ensure that the rotary machines continue in Rugby.
Delivery of the Tempest programme, as driven by BAE Systems and Walton, is essentially to manage the future military air requirements of the United Kingdom. Can the Minister confirm continued government support for the combat air strategy as outlined by the Prime Minister at Farnborough?
Well, again, my honourable friend has secured a debate just last week on this very issue, and he obviously is fighting hard for his constituents who work at BAE Systems. And, of course, the government continues in delivering the combat air strategy that, as he says, was launched at Farnborough last year. This is a big piece of work that is looking at the Future Air Systems Technology Initiative. The government will continue to look at all of the innovative technologies that will need to be available whilst we explore a broad range of options to deliver the capability.
Mr. Pollard.
The cross-party report into shipbuilding that recommended the new Royal Fleet auxiliary ships are built in British shipyards is absolutely vital, enjoys cross-party support. Can I ask the Minister, has he read the report, and will he meet the officers of that group to take forward our recommendations?
Well, I'm more than happy to meet with the honourable gentleman and with others who have shown an interest in this. As I said earlier, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, is currently conducting the review into the Mars tankers to see how we can learn from that and how we can really maximise the opportunities that will exist for the supply chain in the UK.
Douglas Chapman.
Mr. Speaker, and in recent days we've heard of foreign shipbuilders pulling out of the bidding process for the fleet solid support ships. If the government is being true to the national shipbuilding strategy, will he accept that time is of the essence, not only for these support ships but also the bidding process for the Type 31 frigates? I know of a yard that has the skills, the experience and the talent and the infrastructure to build these ships, for the UK. We're good to go in Rosyth, and for the sake of the jobs and for the industry, will the Minister start signing the contracts?
Well, he mentions the Type 31, and of course that is a UK-only competition, and we will wait for the results of that later this year. Also, on the Fleet Solid Support ships, I am pleased that there is a UK consortium in there. I can confirm that Fincantieri have withdrawn from the competition, but I'm not going to comment on any other because it's purely speculation at this stage.
Topical questions. Maggie through.
Topical question number 1. Full and effective global compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention remains a priority for the Ministry of Defence. The use of chemical weapons in Syria by the Assad regime has caused extreme human suffering. A leader who uses chemical weapons against their own people should face consequences, and we remain firm in our resolve to respond appropriately to any use of chemical weapons by that regime.
Through.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to add my welcome to my right honourable friend to her new role and wish her every success. Would my right honourable friend update the House on the timetable for bringing forward the necessary legislation needed to renew our Trident nuclear missile capabilities? Well, I thank my honourable friend for her kind remarks, but no legislation is required, as she suggests. In 2016, this House, by an overwhelming majority, supported the assessment that the UK's continuous at-sea deterrence posture will remain essential to the UK's security.
Dear Griffith.
Speaker, well, further to welcoming the Secretary of State to her position, I'd also like to pay tribute to her service in our Royal Navy. And moreover, we on these benches are committed to working constructively with her on areas where there is clear consensus. One of those is on personnel numbers. Every service is now smaller than it was at this time last year. The Army alone has seen a drop of 2,000 trained personnel, which is a staggering failure after all the promises we've heard at that dispatch box. Her predecessors completely failed to get to grips with this, so what is she going to do differently to turn things around?
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady for her kind remarks and also the fact that she has indicated that she wants to work constructively on issues where we agree. And I would particularly thank her for the remarks that she has made following the announcement that I made about ending vexatious litigation and other such activity against our veteran community and members of the armed forces. I know she took a huge amount of abuse for saying that, but I would ask her to stick to her guns and not wobble on that, and I thank her for that. I would also suggest my honourable friend Minaf has outlined the work that's being done to increase recruitment and retention in our armed forces, but part of it is to also talk up and explain what our armed forces do, and I sincerely wish that more people followed the Honourable Lady's lead and did that and supported our armed forces, why they're important to society, why they're important to social mobility and everything this great nation stands for.
Ian Griffith.
Well, I thank the Secretary of State for her answer. Now, there's another area where we have consensus, and that's on spending. The Secretary of State said recently that she is determined that the commitments made in the 2015 SDSR should remain on track. And yet, according to the National Audit Office, the huge shortfall in the Defence Equipment Plan is putting several programmes at risk. Despite her immediate predecessor's well-publicised theatrics, he failed to deliver sufficient additional funds to plug the gap. So can she tell us what she will do to guarantee the investment in defence that we want to see?
Well, I think in addition to looking at the budget, we also need to look at the behaviours that have led to the fact that previous SDSRs have not been fulfilled. I dwelled on that in the speech that I gave at the Sea Power Conference, and I think we have to have some more honesty about the costs, about what it will take to deepen our partnership with industry to ensure we have those long order books which reduce the cost of procurement. We know what needs to be done, and that should be our focus as well as talking to the Treasury.
Portland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Veterans of national service feel as though their service has been unrecognised over many years. What plans does the Secretary of State have to recognise those veterans who were forced to join up in terms of national service?
Well, I'm interested if my honourable friend has particular suggestions where we do recognise that perhaps previously things have not been done as they should. We are very interested. The MOD has a track record of rectifying those situations, so I'll be happy to discuss this with him if he has particular proposals in mind.
McCarthy.
In January, the former Secretary of State made a visit to Somaliland, which was very well received. Could the new Secretary of State tell me whether she shares his opinion of the strategic importance of Somaliland? Are we looking to set up a naval base there, for example? And does she agree with me that recognition of Somaliland is the way forward if we are to establish such a relationship?
Well, I'm not going to comment on future deployments, but what I would say, having also visited Somalia, though not Somaliland, is that we do need to understand what the strategic importance of that part of the world is to us here in the United Kingdom, not least because of its position on our trade routes, and much of our trade does indeed go past that part of the world, and that's why we continue to be committed in our support both to the true contributing nations in training for the peacekeeping mission.
Procurement Minister, please confirm that the Type 31E frigate is still intended to be exported, and if so, that early talks have been had with the Department of International Trade and Defence export sales on specifications and timing, so that this made-in-Britain ship can be boosting Allied fleets around the world in due course.
I can absolutely confirm that, hence the reason we've put an E on the end of Type 31 to show that this is a ship that we want to export. We want to show what UK industry can do and the capability that it can provide to other nations. If we look at the success of the Type 26, and I'm sure that the Type 31 will follow.
Mr. Speaker, the transition from employment to retirement is a critical time for the health and well-being of a worker, and I should know because I tried it out myself in 2015. If not handled properly, it can lead to mental ill health and even early death. Can I ask the Minister what steps, right honourable member, what steps she is taking to improve the well-being of both armed forces and civil servants as they make this important transition?
Well, the honourable gentleman touches on something that is so important. When I served, there was not a transition process at all. Now you put your hand up and say you're going to depart. You go through what can be a 2-year programme to get you ready for civilian industry. And thankfully, 95% of those who go through that programme are either in work or back in education after they leave. And that's a great statistic we're looking at. You're right, there's a focus on mental health as well. That's why we had Mental Health Awareness Week last week, to make sure veterans know if they require support, it's there to be found.
David Evans.
Mr. Speaker, what progress has there been on the rollout of veteran-friendly general practitioner services in hospitals as part of efforts to make sure veterans get the help they need from the NHS, particularly those suffering from mental health?
I'm grateful for that question from my right honourable friend, because it focuses that this isn't the MOD that provides the veteran support. It's actually the NHS services across the country. And each NHS authority should have a TILS programme, Transition Intervention Liaison Service, designed to help those people who require mental health support. And if they need advanced support, there are the complex mental health facilities as well.
Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister talked earlier about the rise in the total number of trained and untrained Army personnel. What proportion of that current number are trained and what proportion untrained?
Off the top of my head, it will be about 75,000 trained and 7,000 untrained. But it's important to understand that there's trainers trained to be an infantry soldier, and then you go on beyond that. And if, for example, you're joining a technical corps, Royal Engineers, Royal Corps Signals, the actual point at which you become fully trained, trade trained, can be even further down the line.
Courts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and referring to my registry of interests. With aircraft such as Poseidon, Rivet Joint coming on stream, which are reliant upon a boom refuelling system, what assessment have ministers made of the requirement for fitting a boom refuelling capability to the air refuelling fleet at Brize Norton, either retrofitting or new airframes?
These aircraft do have an endurance that will enable them to meet the requirement for core UK missions without the need for air-to-air refuelling. For extended endurance missions, they are fitted with boom refuelling receptacles and our allies can also provide air-to-air refuelling as required.
The government was reported last week to be trying to enthusiastically find an alternative to the Galileo space system. Could the Minister indicate where the £3 to £5 billion for this is coming from?
Well, as the honourable gentleman will know, following the issues around Galileo, the government announced £95 million to explore exactly what our future options and capabilities could be. That work is still ongoing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend, the Minister for the Armed Forces Personnel, was good enough to meet with Rock to Recovery, who specialise in providing mental health coaching for veterans and current service personnel. Would he set out how he intends to use this solution as part of the treatment for future issues in this area?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to Rock to Recovery and the honourable gentleman's support for it. It's one of over 400 service-facing military charities that do such an excellent job in not only just taking sports and so forth, but actually advancing them and giving a new chapter, a focus for those veterans that require support. So I give thanks to the work they've done and to the other charities that are doing exactly the same.
John McNally.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Royal United Services Institute has confirmed the UK will not be able to replicate many of the security benefits of EU membership if we leave. And given confirmation of Russian hackers attacking media, telecoms and energy companies, will the Secretary of State give an assessment to the House of what capacity we are losing by leaving the EU and outline the government's costed proposals?
Well, while we are leaving the EU, European defence cooperation doesn't end, and I would point to recent deployments in Poland and Estonia to demonstrate that we are continuing that cooperation and it will be enhanced.
Mr. Speaker, as she knows, Care After Combat do amazing work rehabilitating veterans who find themselves in the criminal justice system with very real success. So what role does she see for that organisation as part of the veterans strategy to continue that work and boost it as we can?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my old friend mentions another excellent charity, Care After Combat, that does such a great job. And I would like to say that the focus that the new Defence Secretary has given us is to see what more we can do to get veterans to support veterans as well. And that's exactly what Care After Combat actually does. I'm also pleased to see these charities working more closely together through the coordination of COBSIO.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our armed forces people, like all public servants, have been undervalued by this Tory government for too long. They've seen the value of their pay plummet in recent years, and now they'll see another delay to their pay award. When's the government going to recognise that people in the front line, protecting our people, can do without money worries, lift the public sector pay cut and get this mess sorted?
The Armed Forces Pay Review Body is about to report, and we will obviously look at that. But what I would gently point out to the honourable gentleman is that esteem for our armed forces is very evident from all parts of this House. I would wish it was slightly more evident from some of his colleagues on his bench.
Suella Braverman.
I'd like to welcome my right honourable friend to her place and put on record my thanks for all her work she's done for the Navy in Portsmouth, from which Fareham has greatly benefited. I've met with serving members of our forces recently in Fareham who have raised serious concerns about service family accommodation, in particular problems with Carillion Amy and the Defence Infrastructure Organisation. Will the Minister meet with me so we can review these matters so that our brave men and women are housed appropriately and with dignity?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. She raises such an important issue. If we are to look after armed forces, if we want to meet those recruitment numbers, if we want to make sure we have the armed forces that we seek to have, that this country expects, then we need to look after them not just on the battlefield, not just through training, but also off the battlefield and through welfare as well. That means that we build the right accommodation for them.
Take a very small number more, one sentence each. Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just last week I read again that another veteran in Hull had taken his own life after failing to be supported adequately. Please, will the Minister look to publishing the statistics on veteran suicides on a regional basis so that we can see the extent of the problem and how we can best support people who have given so much for us?
Mr. Speaker, every suicide is a tragedy, and she is absolutely right. We need to better understand the numbers that are coming through. I'm pleased to say that you're less likely to be affected, consider suicide less likely to be affected by mental health. This is less likely to be affected by drug issues and so forth if you join the armed forces. But if you go down that road, if you're affected by those issues, help must be available, and that comes with understanding the situation. We are working with Manchester University to better understand the statistics, and also be speaking to the Justice Minister to see how we can get the numbers from the coroners, match them with our databases, and see for sure exactly the background of those who have taken their lives.
Theodocracy. Will the Secretary of State join me in thanking the men and women of the King's Royal Hussars Battle Group in Estonia for the terrific work they are doing in reassuring our NATO allies of our full commitment to the NATO alliance?
Well, I had enormous pleasure in visiting that battle group only last week in Estonia, and I was tremendously impressed, not least with the way that they are demonstrating our interoperability with our fellow NATO allies.
Grady. What steps is the Secretary of State going to take to minimise or indeed eradicate the practice of double counting spending towards both the 0.7% aid target and the 2% NATO military spending target?
Yeah. I think I'm going to have to issue an explanatory note for the honourable gentleman on this. If you are trying to spend ODA money on things that are not ODA eligible, it is not ODA. It's as simple as that. We don't mark our own homework on either ODA spend or indeed the NATO 2% commitment. And I think he should, instead of asking those questions repeatedly, both DFID and defence questions, he should actually take some pride in the fact that the United Kingdom makes both those commitments.
Yes. They're extremely important matters, but in the name of their intelligibility to people who are not members of the House, I should point out that ODA in this context is not O-D-O-U-R, but rather O-D-A, for the avoidance of a scintilla of doubt. Mr Alberto Costa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What assessment has the Minister made of mental health care services for veterans available in South Leicestershire and the wider East Midlands?
Minister Elwood.
Well, part of the Mental Health Awareness Week was to raise awareness exactly of where veterans can provide help. And as I was touching on earlier, every regional NHS authority must have a TILS programme in place. What we need to do better at is communicating that to our veterans, so when they are down in a very dark place, they know where help can be found. And that we're working with the charities to make sure that we can better improve the communication.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In Cranhill this morning I met an Afghanistan veteran who has profound mental health issues but has been found to be in the low rate of PIP. Will the Minister work with me to make representations to DWP to make sure we look after this veteran and get him justice and what he really deserves from the DWP?
Okay. Mr Speaker, just clarifying what the position is. Firstly, to make it clear that those who have served in Afghanistan and in Iraq, we now keep track of them in a way that we've not done before. So we are having a much better relationship with the veterans as they depart. I'll be delighted to meet with the honourable gentleman to discuss this issue in more details. It is important that those who are affected by any aspect of mental issues receive the support from this country, from a very grateful nation.
Two notable parliamentary celebrities, the chairman of the Select Committee and a former Minister for the Armed Forces. It's very awkward. No, too modest, Dr Lewis. Dr Julian Lewis.
As a naval reservist herself, will the Secretary of State personally look into the removal of the captain of HMS Queen Elizabeth, apparently on the grounds that what may have been a misunderstanding in the use of a car supplied by the Ministry of Defence? If we lose talented people like this, surely it's not only unjust, but it's a waste of all the investment that has been made in someone's 29-year unblemished career.
Here.
Well, I can give my right honourable friend assurances that I am fully aware of this situation, and I do understand his concern when we have invested in an individual that they are not able to carry out the tasks for which they trained. He remains in the Royal Navy, and it is a matter for the Royal Navy to deal with, and they are dealing with it.
Mr Speaker, can I ask the Secretary of State, she's very familiar with Portsmouth, but will she make one of her first Royal Navy visits to Devonport so she can maintain as similar familiarity with the expertise and skills that we have in Plymouth as well?
Well, I would say that if you are a Royal Navy reservist, you cannot avoid being very familiar with Plymouth, and I'd be very happy to visit Both Faslane and also Plymouth are other Navy bases as well as Portsmouth.
Well, we're well out of time, but we've got to hear the Right Honourable Gentleman for Rayleigh and Wickford. Mark Francois.
Bless you, Mr. Speaker.
Don't say that often.
Mr. Speaker, several weeks ago I tabled a name day question to the department asking them how many soldiers were enlisted into the regular army in the year 2018-19. And unless I've missed it, sir, I haven't yet had even a holding reply. So as this relates to my great friend's Crapita, when can I expect an answer to that question, even though we all know the answer will be embarrassing?
Minister!
Promptly.
Yes, that is a matter of interpretation. We're grateful. We proceed, thank you, colleagues, we proceed to the urgent question. Mr. David Davis.
Mr. Speaker, to ask the Secretary of State for Defence if she will make a statement on the Ministry of Defence's policy on cooperating with the use of torture overseas.
Secretary of State for Defence, Secretary Penny Mordaunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK Government stands firmly against torture and does not participate in, solicit, encourage or condone the use of torture or cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment for any purpose. Our policy and activities in this area are in accordance with both domestic and international law. The MOD's policy is aligned with the Government's policy on sharing and receiving intelligence, and the Investigatory Powers Commissioner has been satisfied with our activities and has not identified issues of concern. However, the Prime Minister has asked the Commissioner to review the Government's consolidated guidance and submit proposals for how it could be improved. Once it has done so, and the Government has a chance to consider them, and I anticipate this will be a matter of weeks, the MOD will review its internal guidance and, as necessary, in the light of any updated guidance that is published.
Mr. David Davis.
I thank the Secretary of State for that answer. Our most senior living soldier, Field Marshal Lord Guthrie, said 10 years ago, torture is illegal. It's a crime in both peace and war that no, repeat, no exceptional circumstances can permit. We need to distinguish ourselves from our enemies. We must not, in the false name of moral equivalence, degrade ourselves to their level. And he was right. The prohibition of torture is one of our few absolute, incontrovertible rights. There can never be a reason or justification for it. And what's more, it doesn't work. It leads to bad intelligence and bad decisions. The decision to undertake the Iraq War, with hundreds of thousands of deaths, the destruction of the stability of the region and the destruction of the reputation of the West was based upon evidence, so-called evidence obtained on the basis of torture. But we cannot ignore the morality or the law. Paragraph 15.9 of the MOD's policy document says, and I quote, information sharing should not proceed unless ministers agree that the potential benefits justify accepting the risk and the legal consequences that may follow. The fundamental problem with paragraph 15.9 is that it presumes ministers can overrule the law, international law, including that on absolute rights such as the prohibition of torture. Yes. They cannot, they must not. I hope that my honourable friend will ensure that they do not. And given the Ministry of Defence claim that IPCO, this is the Investigatory Powers Oversight Body, approves this, can she publish the documents that show that? It seems to me that IPCO may have approved the overall approach, but not the precise policy document I was referring to, which, as I understand it, was published after their consultation. So can she make sure that that document, which appears to give ministers the right to overrule the law, is published with any commentary on it?
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend for tabling this question? This is a critical issue. I agree with what he has said 100%, and it is worth us reminding ourselves that these laws and norms are there not just to protect the enemy, they also protect our own armed forces too. We cannot overrule the law, nor can ministers be advised to overrule the law or disregard the law. As I said, we have an opportunity to review this. I want to wait until the advice has been received back from the Commissioner, but I understand this will only be a few weeks, and I will update the House as we review our own guidance. With regard to documentation being in the public domain, I understand that following the FOI request, one of the iterations of policy has been placed in the public domain, and the latest reiteration from 2018 doesn't introduce any substantial changes and introduces a minor request at the request of the IPCO. But I think that these matters should receive the full light of day and full transparency, and if my right honourable friend will bear with me, once I receive the advice, I will of course update the House on these important and critical issues.
Neil Griffith.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, today's revelations that the MOD has discreetly rewritten government policy on torture are extremely concerning. Torture is not only morally reprehensible, but it is also prohibited under international law, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and in the Convention Against Torture. Mr. Speaker, there can be no justification whatsoever for torture. Nonetheless, today's reports suggest that, according to the Ministry of Defence, torture is acceptable if, and I quote from the policy document, ministers agree that the potential benefits justify accepting the risk and the legal consequences that may follow. Can the Secretary of State confirm what the government considers these potential benefits to be? Mr. Speaker, in response to these reports, the MOD has denied any wrongdoing, maintaining that the policy and activities in this area comply with the Cabinet Office's consolidation guidance on torture. However, that guidance clearly sets out that in no circumstance will UK personnel ever take action amounting to torture. It further maintains that where the government cannot mitigate the serious risk of torture at the hands of a third party, the presumption would be that we will not proceed. Can the Secretary of State therefore clarify how her department has come to its conclusion? What legal advice has it received? And will she now publish this advice, if any? We understand that this policy came into effect in November 2018. Could the Secretary of State tell the House how many times since then a government minister has decided to authorise the transmission of intelligence which may have led to torture? No minister should be authorising any action where there is a serious risk of it leading to torture. Will the Secretary of State, therefore, now do the right thing and commit to scrapping this policy immediately so as to ensure that basic human rights and international law are universally respected and upheld?
Well, I can give the Right Honourable Lady the assurances that she wishes. It is not our policy in any way to condone torture or facilitate it taking place. Quite the reverse, as I set out earlier. No ministers have been involved in decisions that would have led to that. Again, I can check that, but that is the assurances that I have received from the department. It is very clear that is not our intention. I can understand the concerns that have been expressed across the House. I know people will understand that I understand very well why such laws and norms are in place. As I say, they are for everyone's benefit and not just our enemies. What I will undertake to do is to look at the guidance and review it, but I think it is prudent to wait for the Commissioner's feedback first. If that were going to take a long period of time, I would take a different view, but it is imminent in a few weeks' time, and I will undertake to do that.
Mr. Andrew Mitchell.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for her response, and surely my right honourable friend for Halton Price has done the House a big service in bringing this matter here today in an urgent question, because it touches upon the reputation of our country. And you, Mr. Speaker, will remember that under the leadership of the right honourable and learned gentleman, my honourable friend for Rushcliffe, on July the 2nd, 2018, he led a number of people across the House on asking for a judicial inquiry into British complicity in torture, and the government promised that it would update the House within 60 days. And now it is day 323, and in spite of that promise, the House has not been given the explanation it requires on that issue. Mr. Speaker, last Friday, the United Nations Committee Against Torture called on the UK, and I quote, to establish without further delay an inquiry on alleged acts of torture and other ill treatment of detainees held overseas, committed by, at the instigation of, or with the consent or acquiescence of British officials. Given British leadership at the United Nations, it is a very sad day when the UN has felt it necessary to pass such a motion. And I urge the government to deliver on its promise to the House and come back on the issue of a judicial inquiry, which, as I say, was promised within 60 days, and we are now on day 323.
Well, my right honourable friend raises some important points. I think it is right, although I completely agree with what has been said by everyone who has spoken so far, just to point out that our armed forces, we hold them to high standards, and the agencies that work with them, we hold them all to high standards. We understand why that is important. We understand why people must be compliant. We understand why there must be accountability and transparency in those policies. Not just on matters of intelligence, but also on targeting policy, on reducing the number of civilian casualties. Part of the reason why we are grappling with the issue of lawfare is because we want to uphold the primacy of international humanitarian law. These things are incredibly important to us. I have undertaken to review this policy. I will be looking at things also more wider and in the round. But what I can reassure this House, and what I would not want to come from the quite right scrutiny of MOD policy, is any suggestion that our armed forces are somehow not upholding international humanitarian law. I know that all sides of this House will know how much that is embedded in their education and in their training, how much it is given with rigour in everything they do before pre-deployment, and where there is wrongdoing, they are held to account, and it is quite right that we should hold them and officials to account for wrongdoing where that happens. But this is not a regular occurrence. It is not something that occurs within our armed forces. They operate to the highest standards.
Mr. Malcolm MacDonald.
Sir, Mr. Speaker, a tangled web has been woven that needs to be unpicked with the greatest transparency. But can I ask, why did it fall to the NGO Reprieve to get this information into the public domain? Why did no one in government think it appropriate to pass this to the Investigatory Powers Commissioner? And although she said she's going to review the policy, can she not go one step further and actually rescind the policy? And can she clarify the MOD statement which she's repeated at the box today, that said the Investigatory Powers Commissioner is entirely satisfied that her department's activities and standards in this, with the department's activities and standards in this area. But given that the Commissioner had not seen the document until last month, how on earth can she be completely satisfied with something that he knew nothing about? Can she also take the opportunity to confirm whether or not she believes, as per the guidance we are discussing, that ministers can authorise UK action where there is a serious risk it will contribute to torture? And in the authorship of this policy was the Attorney-General. At any time consulted, because it's quite clear that the House will not accept any deviation from the strictest observance of both domestic and international law. And finally, Mr. Speaker, with last month having a UK Defence Secretary sacked for leaking from the Security Council, this month we find out that the MOD are potentially freelancing in torture and potentially breaking the law, many of us are left asking what on earth is going on at her department.
Well, I think it is incredibly important. I can understand the concerns that have been expressed about a policy, but you cannot draw from that action is being taken or incidents that have happened. I don't think you can draw that conclusion. What I can say to him is that this policy is not new, nor has it been secret. The Prime Minister, in response to the honourable gentleman's question, asked the Investigatory Powers Commissioner to review the guidance, and he has seen the MOD's policy. What I said is that he has no issue and believes the MOD's current policy is consistent with that guidance. I would repeat that no minister could break the law or be advised to break the law by an official. That could not happen, just to reassure him on that point. And the Attorney-General is routinely and regularly involved in forming policies of this nature, and they are also a member of the National Security Council.
On agree. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I endorse what my right honourable friend has said? The idea that this is some extraordinary leak displaying some novel policy is wholly and completely erroneous. And if anybody wishes to go away and read the Intelligence and Security Committee's report on detention and rendition, they will find a lengthy section on current issues which deals with this precise matter, setting out the consolidated guidance in virtually identical form to that which exists and I understand is currently being used in the MOD. That having been said, however, I welcome the Secretary of State's review of this issue, and I would also point out that in the detention and rendition report, my committee made clear that this was one of those exceptional areas dealing with serious risk. You can never authorise or sanction the use of torture. It is wholly contrary to international law. But where there is a serious risk, there was a need, we pointed out, for there to be some form of process by which an evaluation could be made in such circumstances. And it was noteworthy that there appeared to be differences at the time we reported between the Home Office, the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence as to what criteria might be applied by individual Secretaries of State. So could I urge my right honourable friend, firstly, to enthusiastically rebut those who suggest that this is an extraordinary revelation, and secondly, to move to respond to what the committee suggested in its report.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for that contribution. I completely agree with what he says, and in addition to the review of the policy, I will certainly give the matters that he raises my urgent attention.
Mr. Andrews-Lauder.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, if this matter is not news to the right honourable member for Beaconsfield and its committee, it does appear to have been news to IPCO, which had to be informed about the matter by freedom of information requests through reprieve. Perhaps the Secretary of State would explain why that's the case. And doesn't this show that the whole so-called war on terror has the lessons from that have not been learned? Would she answer the question? She gave a long answer to the member for Sutton Coldfield, but she didn't answer the actual question, which is when are we going to have the announcement on the judge-led inquiry?
Secretary of State.
Well, first of all, I would just point out that the change to the policy that was introduced in 2018 was an amendment at the request of the IPCO. I am going to, as I say, it is only a short number of weeks before we will get the review back from the Commissioner, and the Government will be able to look at the recommendations that it makes. I will look at this in the round, as you would expect, as a new Secretary of State coming into the Department, and I will update the House. I fully hear what all members on all sides of the House are saying. I understand, and I hope the House has confidence in the fact that I understand how critically important these issues are, as I say again, for the safety of our own armed forces as well as other people, and I will give it my urgent attention.
And Dr. Julian Lewis.
If anyone ever tries to tempt the Secretary of State with the maxim that the end justifies the means, will she bear in mind the very wise words of Sir Robert Thompson, probably the leading counterinsurgency expert of the 1960s, who wrote about torture and other extrajudicial means? Not only is this morally wrong, but over a period it will create more practical difficulties for a government than it solves. A government which does not act in accordance with the law forfeits the right to be called a government and cannot then expect its people to obey the law.
Well, I quite agree with my right honourable friend. It is absolutely fundamental to everything that we stand for, everything that our armed forces represent, that we uphold the law, we uphold international humanitarian law, and we abide by those rules. I could not agree with him more.
And Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, although they're no longer with us today, I did know in my time several people who suffered torture both in the Far East and in Europe. And although I was a young man, when they recounted their tales, they didn't want to tell me what happened. It was ghastly, let's just put it that way. Now, I just want to make clear, I have every faith that our armed forces observe the very highest standards of conduct. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. But unfortunately, and I use this word carefully, we are perceived to be in a difficult situation at this point. So what I want to do is to broaden this out. It strikes me that the UK, we talk about exerting our soft power. If we were to be seen in the world as the champion of outlawing torture, we could strike a mighty blow for getting rid of this horrible crime. It would do our reputation no harm in the world at all. And many years ago, we led the charge against the slave trade. Why don't we do exactly the same for torture?
So do you stay?
Well, I completely agree with what the honourable gentleman has said. Indeed, the Royal Navy played a huge role in ending the slave trade. We have our nation has a huge heritage in that respect. What I would also add to what has been said is that this shows why, in conjunction with this issue, which I will deal with, we have to also tackle the wider issue of lawfare, that basket of issues which is corrupting our operational effectiveness and putting huge pressure on our armed forces in the field to take decisions that are the wrong thing to do. Mr. Speaker, if I can just give one example from Afghanistan, I believe, where a member of our armed forces was sued for detaining a prisoner for longer than the prescribed amount of time in order to keep that prisoner safe from being put into a prison where they would have been tortured. That's the right decision to take. Currently, members of our armed forces are pursued for taking those decisions and upholding international humanitarian law. So we've got to get that right too. I think that our armed forces resist those immense pressures that are put on them when they're making those decisions in theatre. But we have to get that right too, and that also is receiving my urgent attention.
Stephen McPartland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's sickening that we've got this guidance on torture, but I am reassured by the words the Secretary of State's given this afternoon. Can she confirm that we will not use all action intelligence that's gathered from third-party torture?
Secretary of State.
I can give my honourable friend that assurance. We do not condone torture. We will not be implicit in it, and we are fully aware of our obligations in terms of third parties.
Jim Cunningham.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Following on from the honourable gentleman who spoke earlier in relation to the United Nations criticism, is the review prompted by that, or is the review prompted by something else? Because I've got lots of constituents who are very concerned about this and the direction it's going. Has she got a date to come forward and tell us what the proposals are?
Stay.
Well, just to clarify, it was the Prime Minister that asked the Commissioner to do this review into the government's guidance. Our guidance at the MOD follows that guidance. It's absolutely in line with that, and I'm told that it will be a couple of weeks before the Commissioner is ready to report. When they do, government will review it, and I will review the MOD's policy.
Davy Perkins.
Can I invite the Secretary of State to respond specifically to the question the Honourable Gentleman from Sutton Coldfield asked about the government's response to the call for a judicial review? We can't blame her for the failures of her predecessors, but we heard that the promise of a response within 60 days was made about 320 odd days ago. So can the Secretary of State come to the dispatch box and make it clear that she will now put right the House hearing her view on that and let us know when we should expect to hear that?
Well, he will understand that I'm a couple of weeks into this role. I am looking at this situation, but I'm not going to make pronouncements at the dispatch box until I'm appraised of all the issues. And I don't think honourable members would expect me to do anything else. What I can assure the House is that I am looking at this issue. I am looking at the policy in relation to this. From what I have seen in the inquiries of the department that I've made so far, I think the House would be reassured about our conduct and decisions that have taken place in the department. I think they have been correct and that honourable members would be reassured of that fact. But I will fully appreciate the House wants to have an update as swiftly as possible, and I will undertake to do that.
Jim Shannon.
Mr Speaker, can the Minister outline her understanding of the definition of torture and also underline that position in civilised society? A Minister, coming from a position of clean hands, that the end does not and will not always justify the means.
Well, I think I hope I have given the House every reassurance. There is a legal definition of torture, and at the beginning of my statement I outlined all the descriptions and forms that might take. It is never justified. It is also, as we know, not a reliable way of getting information or being able to act on that information. We must not do it. Ministers should not do it or allow it to be done. That is a breach of the law, and no official could advise a minister of that course of action.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Mr Speaker, while the Secretary of State seeks to reassure the House, I'm sure they may be aware that the Investigatory Powers Commission Office consultation into the Cabinet Office consolidated guidance that is on intelligence sharing related to detainees closed on the 28th of November 2018. Yet the MOD policy was introduced, was only simply dated November 2018. So therefore, was it dated or introduced on the 28th, 29th or 30th to avoid being actually included in the IPCO consultation?
Secretary of State.
My understanding is that it followed that updated advice, and the changes made to the 2018 document were at the request of the IPCO. That is my understanding of the situation, but not to be confused with the piece of work that has been ongoing with the Commissioner and that is due to report back, again, as I say, in a few weeks' time.
On break.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As we heard from the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield, in the course of its inquiry, the ISC asked a number of Secretaries of State whether they believed the policy allowed them to authorise action where there was a serious risk of torture, and each gave significantly different answers. Can the Secretary of State explain how she will be able to ensure that there is a consistent approach to this from all Secretaries of State?
Secretary of State.
Well, I think that the confidence that the honourable member and other members of this House can get is that the processes in the department have to be right. Clearly, different people coming into office and holding ministerial office will have different views on a whole raft of subjects. They may have different experiences which they bring to bear in making a decision. But the key thing that should give us confidence is that no member of our armed forces, no civil servant working in defence could give advice that would take a course of action or get a minister to decide a course of action which could lead to an individual being knowingly tortured. And that, I think, is very clear. That, I have to say, has been my experience of the calibre of individuals working at the department, both in the last few weeks, but also in my time as MIN-AF. But those are the people that we have to trust. And I think a duty of ministers, and in particular the Secretary of State, is to reinforce that in the department through policies, through transparency and through clarity in what it is we are trying to achieve and the law that we're trying to uphold.
Thank you. Order. Statement, the Secretary of State for International Development. Secretary Rory Stewart.
Well, thank you very, very much, Mr. Speaker. Ebola is back, this time in the eastern DRC. This is the largest outbreak in the country's history. It's the second largest outbreak in the world and the first in a conflict zone. So far, 1,209 people have died, and we must do much more to grip this situation. This is not a simple question of virus control. If it were, we could simply repeat what we were able, at huge risk and cost, to do in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and even, to some extent, what the government of the DRC and the WHO were able to do in Equator and Western DRC over the first 6 months of last year. That is to get out into village after village, identify all the cases, trace all their contacts and the contacts of the contacts, and through preventing further chains of transmission, contain the outbreak. But this is not a situation like this. This is North Kivu. This is the centre of a conflict dominated by dozens of separate armed groups, largely outside government control. Such groups have begun to attack and kill health workers, meaning that key international experts have had to be withdrawn from the epicentre of the virus. And the decision not to allow this province to participate in the recent elections, partly on the grounds that this is an Ebola area, has fuelled suspicion that Ebola is a fabrication developed by hostile political forces. As a result, Mr. Speaker, communities are reluctant to come forward when they have symptoms. They're reluctant to change burial practices or accept the highly effective trial vaccine. The Congolese army and government, which have successfully contained 9 previous Ebola outbreaks over the last 45 years, is struggling to operate in the epicentre of this outbreak, and so too are UN peacekeepers and the WHO. And although this area is very dangerous and difficult to access, it is not sparsely populated. The epicentre of the outbreak is Butembo, which has a population of 1 million people. The surrounding areas contain almost 18 million people. Now, to be clear, the current disease profile poses, according to all our expert analysis here, at the moment only a low to negligible risk to the United Kingdom. So this statement should not be a cause for panic at home. But this outbreak is potentially devastating for the region. It could spread easily to neighbouring provinces and even to neighbouring countries. Now, I want to take a moment to commend all of those, both the Congolese government and the international community, who are working in these very difficult situations to bring this disease under control. My predecessor, the Right Honourable Member for Portsmouth North, who just made her statement to the House, paid tribute to Dr. Richard Valerie Mukuzo Kibum, who was killed in an attack by an armed group on the 19th of April while working for WHO in the Ebola response on the front line. I would like to, and I imagine the whole House would join with me, in expressing the deepest condolences to the family, friends and colleagues of Dr. Richard and to all of those who've lost loved ones as a result of this outbreak. We now need to grip this situation and ensure that this disease is contained. As you can imagine, this has been my key priority in the emergency field since I was appointed to this role just over 2 weeks ago. I spent the weekend in discussions with Sir Mark Lowcock, the UN Humanitarian Coordinator, and with the Director General of the WHO, Dr. Tedros, who has so far paid 8 visits personally to the affected area. I've also spoken about the response to the Deputy Secretary-General of the UN, Amina Mohammed, and I'm pleased to see that there has been a real step up in terms of the UN staff on the ground, in terms of coordination and in terms of the seniority of those staff, particularly in places like Butembo. Both the Health Secretary and the Foreign Secretary have been supporting this agenda in recent meetings over the last 4 days, the G7 health meeting and the WHO meetings in Geneva. And I've also convened a meeting with a number of international experts in the field, including Brigadier Kevin Beaton, who helped to lead the UK military response in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and the Chief Medical Officer to the UK government. I've concluded on the basis of their advice that we need not only to provide more money immediately to support the frontline response, that's the health workers, but also to support the vaccination strategy and to put more of our expert staff on the ground into the response. This is not just about recruiting doctors. We need people who understand and can work with the DRC government, the military, and even the opposition forces in order to create the space for us to work. We need people who know the UN system well so that they can drive and shape the UN response. And these people need to be not in London, but on the ground, because they need to be able to learn and adapt very quickly as the disease spreads. We are already deploying epidemiologists through our public health rapid support teams in partnership with the Department of Health and Social Care. I'm also now considering deploying additional officials with specialities in information management, adaptive management, anthropology, and strategic communications. It's, however, important for us all to understand that this is not a problem that the international community can solve from a distance. This is a political and security crisis as much as a health crisis, and the response must, in the end, be driven by local health workers and local leaders. There are some positive signs. DFID has been a key player in developing a new experimental vaccine for Ebola, which is proving highly effective. Over 119,000 doses have been administered so far in eastern DRC. This is an achievement that's probably saved thousands of lives. Modelling from Yale suggests that the use of the vaccine has reduced the geographic spread of Ebola by nearly 70%. And this isn't just about statistics. This is about, for example, Danielle. It's a 42-day-old baby in eastern Congo who survived Ebola last week, thanks to the inspiring work of community volunteers, themselves Ebola survivors, and frontline health workers supported by UK aid. And of course, we cannot do it alone. This needs grip and urgency, but it also needs humility. One of the reasons that I've been talking in detail about this issue to Mark Green, who's my US opposite number, is not only that we share the US analysis, but also that the Americans will inevitably be major players in this response in terms of finance and in terms of expertise, as indeed they were in the Liberia Ebola outbreak.